The tray of crystal tumblers felt like a lead weight in my hands, the ice clinking rhythmically, a high society heartbeat that I had to keep silent. I stood in the shadows of a mahogany archway at midnight blue, watching Seoul's untouchables drift through the haze of expensive cigar smoke as if I were part of the furniture. Blue neon light washed the room in a cold, artificial glow, making the men's gold watches flash like warning beacons. I'd polished my shoes until my fingers ached, but I could still feel the staggering difference between my polyester vest and the bespoke silk suits whispering past me. Every person in this room spoke the secret language of power, the predatory tilt of a head, the calculated silence of a deal being made, the effortless authority of knowing your name alone could ruin a life. I was fluent in none of it. "Keep moving, Seabin," Madame Song's voice hissed through my earpiece, sharp enough to draw blood. I glided past a corner booth without looking at the men inside, my eyes trained on the floor. To them, I was just a ghost in a high-collar uniform, a professional shadow trained to see everything and say nothing. My boss insisted that my invisibility was my greatest asset for the lounge's efficiency, but tonight, my name tag felt more like a toe tag. 3 hours into the shift, I had served a dozen men who smiled like saints, while their hands stayed buried in pockets gripping cold steel, and I had survived exactly 0 seconds of being seen as a human being. That was the surface, but beneath the jazz and the clinking glass, in the heavy air between breaths, was a cold, suffocating tension. It started the moment he walked in, and I realized that being invisible was about to become my greatest curse. The safe house library felt less like a room and more like a velvet-lined trap. Floor-to-ceiling shelves of leather-bound books absorbed the sound of my frantic breathing, leaving nothing but a heavy, expectant silence. Kwon Tae-Jun sat behind a desk of dark obsidian, having discarded his suit jacket. His white silk shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the corded tension in his neck. He didn't look like a man who had almost been murdered an hour ago. He looked like a king bored with his own court. "You're starring, Seabin," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to settle in the marrow of my bones. He didn't look up from the folder in front of him. "It's a dangerous habit for a ghost." I gripped the edge of the velvet chair, my knuckles white. "I want to go home. I saved your life. That should be the end of it." Finally, he looked up. His eyes were 2 burning coals in the dim light. "The moment you wrote that note, home ceased to exist. You saw the face of the man who poisoned my glass. You saw the architect's signal. In my world, that makes you a liability or an asset. I'm giving you the chance to choose the latter." He slid a single sheet of paper across the obsidian. It was a contract, written in the cold, precise language of a merger. "I need someone who can see the rot I've grown too used to. I need the girl who clears coasters but counts heartbeats. You will act as my logistics consultant. You will live here. You will be at my side at every event until I find the leak in my syndicate." I looked at the figure at the bottom of the page. My heart stuttered. $50,000. It was more than I'd earn in 5 years at the lounge, but it felt like the price tag on a coffin. I thought of the debt my father had left behind, the damp walls of my studio apartment, and the way Madame Song looked at me like I was disposable. I looked Tae-Jun in the eye, my spine finally snapping into place. 60,000, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "And a meeting with the Black Dragon's board to discuss a permanent position in logistics once this is over. If I'm risking my life to find your traitor, I'm not doing it for a paycheck. I'm doing it for a future." A flicker of something, not quite a smile, but a glint of genuine interest, crossed his granite features. He leaned forward, the scent of expensive tobacco and rain filling the space between us. "You're negotiating with a man who could have you erased before you hit the floor," he whispered. "I'm negotiating with a man who would be dead if I hadn't reached for a napkin," I countered. Tae-Jun reached out, his thumb grazing the back of my hand. The heat of it sent a jolt through me that wasn't entirely fear. 60,000 then, but remember, Seabin, once you step into my shadow, the light will never find you the same way again." The morning sun didn't so much rise as it invaded the safe house, reflecting off the glass walls with a clinical, unforgiving brightness. I stood in the center of a dressing suite that was larger than my entire apartment, watching as 3 women in silent, gray uniforms unzipped garment bags with the precision of surgeons. "The polyester has to go, Sebin," Tae-Jun's voice drifted from the doorway. He was leaned against the frame, a cup of black coffee in his hand, watching me with an unnerving, analytical gaze. "If you are to be my shadow, you must look like you belong to the darkness, not the service entrance." They draped the first piece over my shoulders, a structured blazer of midnight blue silk that felt like liquid steel. When I looked in the mirror, the ghost was gone. The fabric nipped at my waist and broadened my shoulders, giving me a silhouette that demanded space rather than apologizing for taking it. It was more than clothes, it was armor. "Now," Tae-Jun said, setting his coffee aside and stepping into my space. The air in the room seemed to vanish. "The most difficult part of the performance isn't the clothes, it's the touch." He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from my waist. I flinched, my instinct to remain untouched screaming in the silence. "Rule 1, he whispered, his eyes locking onto mine. "You do not flinch. In this world, a flinch is an admission of guilt or fear. Neither is allowed." He placed his hand firmly on the small of my back. The heat of his palm seared through the silk, a heavy, grounding weight. "You must lean into me as if I am the only thing keeping you upright. It is a dance of possession. If the board sees a gap between us, they will fill it with a knife." He moved closer, his other hand coming up to tilt my chin. His thumb traced my jawline, a gesture that was terrifyingly intimate yet clinical. "When I speak to you in public, you look at my mouth, then my eyes. You don't look at the exits. You don't look at the guards. I am your entire world." I forced myself to breathe, to let my muscles relax against his touch. I mirrored his stance, my hand rising to rest tentatively on his forearm. I felt the corded strength beneath his sleeve, the raw power of the black dragon. "Better," he murmured, his breath warm against my temple. "You're learning to speak the language, Sebin. Just remember, the more convincing the lie, the more dangerous it is when you start to believe it." He stepped back, the sudden absence of his heat leaving me feeling strangely exposed despite the expensive silk. I looked at my reflection one last time. The waitress was buried under layers of midnight blue and gold, but as I adjusted the dragon ring on my finger, I wondered if I was putting on armor or stepping into a cage. The black sedan glided through the iron gates of the Kwon estate like a shark moving into deeper, darker waters. Beside me, Tae-Jun was a statue of tailored charcoal wool, his presence radiating a cold, focused energy that made the interior of the car feel smaller with every passing second. He hadn't spoken since we left the safe house, but as the sprawling, minimalist mansion came into view, a fortress of glass and limestone, he reached over and interlaced his fingers with mine. His grip was firm, a silent command to keep my pulse from racing. "My mother sees everything," he said, his voice barely a whisper against the hum of the engine. "She doesn't look for flaws in your dress, Sebin. She looks for the flicker in your eyes when you lie. Give her nothing but the truth we've built." Heavy oak doors were opened by a staff that moved with the same eerie, synchronized silence I had mastered at the lounge. We were led into a dining room that felt like a sanctuary of ancient power. At the head of the table sat Madame Park Sun-young. She was draped in a high-collared hanbok of muted silver, her hair pulled back into a knot so tight it seemed to sharpen her already lethal cheekbones. She didn't rise. She simply watched us approach, her eyes 2 chips of obsidian reflecting the candlelight. "Tae-Jun," she said, her voice possessing the texture of crushed velvet. "You've finally brought the girl who caused such a stir at the Midnight Blue." Tae-Jun pulled out my chair, his hand lingering on my shoulder for a beat too long, a calculated display of possession. "Min Si-bin," he introduced me, his tone brook no argument. "The woman who saved my life and the only person I trust to watch my back." Madame Park turned her gaze toward me. It wasn't a look, it was an interrogation. "A waitress," she murmured, the word hanging in the air like a faint insult. "A ghost who stepped into the light. Tell me, Sebin, do you find the transition from serving drinks to sitting at this table intoxicating, or is it merely a more expensive cage?" I felt the familiar spine Tae-Jun had admired click into place. I didn't look at the silverware or the porcelain. I looked directly into the eyes of the matriarch. It's a negotiation, madam, I replied, my voice holding steady. In the lounge, I learned that the most powerful people are often the most vulnerable because they believe their own myths. I'm not here for the wine. I'm here because your son recognizes that sometimes the only way to see a predator is to stand in the shadows they ignore. The room went deathly still. I felt Tae-Jun's hand tighten slightly on the table. For a long, agonizing moment, Madam Park remained motionless. Then, a slow, terrifyingly beautiful smile touched her lips, the warmth of a cobra before it strikes. She has teeth, Tae-Jun, she said, picking up her wine glass. Let us see if she knows how to use them before the night is over. The dessert course arrived with a clinical precision that did nothing to thaw the atmosphere. Tae-Jun had been called away to the terrace by a hushed whisper from Kang Di-hyun, leaving me alone with the silent matriarch and the sharp, hungry eyes of Kwon Jinwoo. The cousin leaned forward, his silk tie shimmering like snakeskin under the chandelier. He hadn't touched his food. He had spent the last 20 minutes dissecting me with his gaze instead. You have a remarkable way with words, Seebin, Jinwoo began, his voice dripping with a false, honeyed warmth. But words are cheap in Seoul. Loyalty, however, has a very specific market price. He toyed with a silver spoon, tapping it rhythmically against the porcelain. Madam Song tells me you were quite the diligent worker. Always on time, always invisible. It makes me wonder what a girl like you would do if the marble boss suddenly lost his shine. If, for instance, a more stable offer were placed on the table. I felt the matriarch's eyes on me, heavy and expectant. This was the trap, the invitation to betray a man I had known for only days. I don't think you understand the nature of our arrangement, Jinwoo, I said, my voice cutting through his rhythmic tapping. I didn't choose Tae-Jun because of his shine. I chose him because he's the only man in this city who realized that the person clearing his table was the only one honest enough to tell him he was being hunted. Stability is a fairy tale in your world. I'd rather bet on the man who survives the storm than the one who tries to buy it. Jinwoo's smile faltered, his eyes darkening. He opened his mouth to retort, but a heavy hand settled on the back of my chair. The air in the room shifted instantly. Tae-Jun had returned. Is my cousin bothering you, Seebin? Tae-Jun asked. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. He didn't wait for an answer. He moved to my side, his thigh brushing against my shoulder as he leaned down. It wasn't a calculated move for the audience this time. His hand found mine beneath the table, his fingers sliding between mine and squeezing with a raw, grounding pressure. In that moment, the fake contract felt like a distant memory. The heat of his skin against mine was the only real thing in a room full of ghosts and vipers. I looked up and caught his gaze. For a split second, the marble mask slipped. I saw a flicker of something fierce and protective, a genuine spark of recognition that transcended the $60,000 deal. He wasn't just my employer, and I wasn't just his consultant. We were two predators sharing the same cage, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the lock. We're leaving, Tae-Jun announced to the room, his eyes never leaving mine. Seebin has seen enough of the family's hospitality for one night. The weeks that followed were a blur of flashbulbs and forced composure. From the neon-lit art galleries of Gangnam to the silent, high-stakes auctions overlooking the Han River, I was no longer Min Seebin, the ghost. I was the woman at Kwon Tae-Jun's side, a living extension of his power. By the third gala, the secret language of the elite felt less like a foreign tongue and more like a script I had mastered. I knew exactly how to tilt my head when a senator's wife spoke, and I knew the precise, cold smile to give when a rival approached with a veiled threat. But the most dangerous part wasn't the performance. It was how easily the mask began to fit. We were standing on the balcony of a private club, the city below a shimmering grid of blue and gold. Inside, the muffled bass of a cello quintet played for a room full of people who would kill for a fraction of Tae-Jun's influence. Outside, there was only the wind and the heavy, magnetic pull of the man beside me. You're doing it again, Tae-Jun murmured. He wasn't looking at the view, he was looking at me, his reflection caught in the glass door behind us. Doing what? I asked, adjusting the heavy diamond necklace that felt like a collar of ice. Counting the heartbeats in the room. Even out here, you're looking for the leak. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over me. He reached out, not to guide me or to perform for a hidden camera, but to brush a stray lock of hair away from my face. His touch was slow, deliberate, and entirely unscripted. "Stop being a consultant for 1 minute, Seabin. Just breathe." I looked up at him, and for the first time I didn't see the marble boss. I saw the exhaustion behind his eyes, the weight of a crown that never let him sleep. My hand moved instinctively, my fingers grazing the cuff of his charcoal suit. The $60,000 deal, the contract, the escape plan, it all felt like a distant, fatting echo. "I forgot how to do that a long time ago," I whispered. "Then let me remind you." He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine. In the silence of the balcony, the air grew thick with a tension that had nothing to do with the syndicate and everything to do with the way his hand was now sliding to the small of my back, pulling me into his space. There were no witnesses here, no matriarch to impress, no Jinwoo to outmaneuver. When he kissed me, it wasn't the sharp, biting claim of a mafia boss. It was a desperate, grounding anchor. It was the moment the performance shattered, leaving us exposed in the dark. As I leaned into him, smelling the rain and expensive spice of his cologne, I realized with a jolt of terror that I wasn't playing a role anymore. I was falling for the man who had bought my life, and in this world, that was the most lethal mistake I could make. The following Tuesday, the temperature in Seoul plummeted, and the atmosphere inside the syndicate's private tea house felt even colder. I sat across from Chairman Oh, a man whose skin looked like yellowed parchment stretched over bone. He didn't possess Tae-Jun's marble intensity. He was a snake in a silk robe, ancient and patient. He poured tea with a hand that didn't tremble, despite the rumors of his failing health. "You've become quite the fixture, Miss Min," Oh began, his voice a dry rasp that set my nerves on edge. He pushed a small porcelain cup toward me. "Tae-Jun has never been a man for hobbies, or for distractions, and yet here you are, a girl from the midnight blue, suddenly holding the keys to the Black Dragon's logistics." I kept my hands folded in my lap, refusing to touch the tea. "I'm a consultant, Chairman. I solve problems that are too small for the boss's attention." "Is that what you call yourself?" He chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering over pavement. "I see the way he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching. It isn't the look of a man with a consultant. It's the look of a man who has finally found something he's afraid to lose." He leaned forward, his eyes milky but sharp. "In our world, a man with something to lose is a man with a target on his back, and you, my dear, are that target." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. I thought of the $60,000 contract and the exit strategy I'd been obsessing over, but suddenly, the money felt like a weight pulling me under. "Tae-Jun doesn't have weaknesses," I said, though my voice lacked its usual spine. "Everyone has a pressure point," Oh countered, his smile widening to reveal teeth that looked too large for his mouth. "I've spent 40 years finding them. Tae-Jun thinks he's built a fortress around you, but even a fortress has a servant's entrance. I know about the debt, I know about your father, and I know that if I were to remove you from the board, Tae-Jun would burn this city down just to find your ashes. That kind of emotional volatility is exactly what the syndicate cannot afford." He stood up, the meeting over before I could find my breath. "Enjoy the view while it lasts, Seabin, but remember, the higher the pedestal, the harder the fall, and the Black Dragon is due for a very long drop." As I walked out to the waiting car where Kang Di-hyun stood like an iron sentinel, I caught my reflection in the window. I looked like a queen, but for the first time, I felt like a sacrificial lamb. Chairman Oh hadn't just identified me as a weak point, he had just signaled that the hunt had officially begun. The rain turned the Seoul skyline into a smeared watercolor of neon and charcoal as our motorcade cut through the Mapo district. Inside the reinforced cabin, the silence was absolute, heavy with the premonition of Chairman Oh's threats. Hana sat opposite me, her eyes darting toward the side mirrors with a rhythmic, feline intensity. She hadn't looked at her phone once in 20 minutes. "Something is wrong," she whispered, her hand moving to the holster concealed beneath her slim-cut blazer. "The lead car is accelerating too fast." Before I could ask what that meant, the world tilted. A black SUV slammed into our flank with a bone-jarring crunch, the sound of twisting metal screaming over the rain. Our car spun, tires shrieking against the asphalt until we were pinned against the concrete barrier of the bridge. "Down! Stay down!" Hana lunged across the seat, her weight pinning me to the floor mats as the first spiderweb of cracks appeared on the bulletproof glass. The rhythmic thwip-thwip of suppressed gunfire peppered the door like hailstones. I could smell the ozone of the car's deployed airbags and the metallic tang of blood. Hana kicked her door open, using it as a shield as she returned fire, her movements a blur of lethal precision. "Seebin, when I say run, you head for the construction pylons. Don't look back for me." "Hana, wait." "Go." I scrambled out of the wreckage, my heels catching on the slick pavement. I tore them off, running barefoot toward the shadows of the nearby construction site. Behind me, I heard the heavy thud of a body hitting the ground and Hana's sharp cry of pain. I stopped, my heart hammering against my ribs. I was the invisible ghost, the girl who survived by staying in the shadows. But as I saw a masked man leveling a weapon at a grounded, bleeding Hana, the spine Tae-Jun had bet $60,000 on took over. I didn't run. I grabbed a heavy iron pipe from a nearby scrap pile. My hands didn't tremble, they burned. As the attacker moved past the pylon, I swung with every ounce of terror and fury I'd suppressed since the night at midnight blue. The impact was sickeningly solid. He crumpled, and I didn't wait to see if he'd get up. I dragged Hana toward the darkness of a half-finished stairwell, my breath coming in ragged gasps. We were trapped. Huddled in the cold concrete, the sound of heavy boots echoing on the metal grating above. I gripped Hana's hand, feeling her pulse flutter like a dying bird. I had spent my life trying to be nothing, but as the shadows closed in, I realized I was finally someone worth killing, and that meant I was someone worth fighting to stay alive. The stairwell smelled of wet concrete and spent gunpowder. Hana's breathing was shallow, a rhythmic rasp that marked the seconds we had left before Chairman O's men circled back. Then, the silence of the bridge was shattered not by gunfire, but by the roar of a high-performance engine screaming toward us. The door to the stairwell was kicked open with such force the hinges groaned. I braced myself, gripping the iron pipe, but the figure that emerged from the rain wasn't an assassin. It was Tae-Jun. He looked like a man possessed, his pristine white shirt splattered with crimson, his eyes wide with a frantic, feral desperation I had never seen on the marble boss. When his gaze found me, the air seemed to rush back into his lungs in a single, ragged sob of relief. He was across the floor in 2 strides, his hands framing my face with a grip that was both iron-strong and trembling. He didn't check for the diamond necklace or the dragon ring. He checked the pulse at my throat as if it were the only thing keeping the world from collapsing. "I thought I'd lost you," he rasped, his forehead dropping against mine. The cold rain from his hair dripped onto my cheeks, mingling with my tears. "I told myself you were a consultant. I told myself this was a contract. But as I drove here, I realized I don't care about the syndicate. I don't care about the board. If they had taken you, Seebin, I would have burned this entire city to the ground just to see by the light of the flames where they hid you." I reached up, my bruised fingers curling into his damp collar. The $60,000 felt like a ghost of a life I didn't recognize anymore. "The contract," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Tae-Jun, the 6 weeks aren't over." He pulled back just enough to look me in the eye, his expression raw and stripped of every mask he had ever worn. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the folded, blood-stained agreement I had signed in the library, and tore it in half. The pieces fluttered into the puddles at our feet. "The contract is dead," he said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal vow. "I'm not paying for a partner anymore. I'm asking for one. No more logistics. No more fake dating. Stay with me because you want to or leave because you're safe. But know that from this moment on, you aren't my shadow. You are my heart. And I will kill anyone who tries to stop it from beating." In the distance, sirens began to wail, cutting through the storm. Kang Di-hyun appeared in the doorway, securing the perimeter, but I didn't move. I leaned into Tae-Jun's chest, listening to the frantic, heavy thud of his heart. The invisible girl was gone, burned away by the heat of his declaration, and in her place stood someone who finally knew exactly what she was worth. The obsidian table of the Black Dragon Syndicate boardroom was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the faces of the most powerful and dangerous individuals in the country. At the head sat Tae-Jun, his marble composure restored, though his hand rested openly on mine atop the table, a public declaration that the time for secrets was over. Across from us, Chairman Oh's seat remained empty, a silent testament to the swift, ruthless purge that had followed the bridge ambush. Madam Park Sun-young sat to my right, her silver handbox shimmering like moonlight on water. She didn't look at me with the warmth of a cobra anymore. Instead, she pushed a heavy, leather-bound folder toward me, the restructured logistics and intelligence assets of the family. "The board has reviewed your performance, Seabin," the matriarch said, her voice steady and clear. "You didn't just find a leak, you survived a war. The Black Dragon does not pay its family members in mere installments. We pay in loyalty and territory." I opened the folder. It wasn't a $60,000 check. It was a partnership agreement, granting me oversight of the syndicate's legitimate trade routes and a seat on the High Council. I looked at the signatures already present, Tae-Jun's bold, sweeping stroke and the matriarch's elegant calligraphy. I thought back to the girl who had trembled in the shadows of the midnight blue, the one who thought her only power was to be invisible. That girl was a ghost now. I picked up the fountain pen, my hand as steady as the man, beside me. "I've made some adjustments to the security protocols for the northern docks," I said, my voice cutting through the room with an authority that didn't need to be loud to be felt. "If we're to move forward, we don't just protect our interests, we expand them. The invisible routes are the ones most vulnerable to people like Chairman Oh. We're closing them. Permanently." Tae-Jun's thumb traced the back of my hand, a small, private smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He wasn't looking at a waitress he had rescued. He was looking at the only person capable of standing beside him in the storm. As I signed my name, the dragon ring on my finger caught the light. I had negotiated for my worth, fought for my life, and finally stepped out of the shadows. I wasn't just Min Seabin anymore, and I wasn't just a consultant. I was the dragon's shadow, and the City of Seoul was finally starting to realize that the most dangerous person in the room is the one they never saw coming.